A poor waitress accidentally smiled at a mafia boss, and that one innocent smile became the most dangerous thing she had ever done. In New Orleans, near the rain-soaked edge of the Mississippi River, Grace Miller was just trying to survive another midnight shift. Her shoes hurt, her rent was late, and the old cafe windows trembled every time thunder rolled over the city. She didn't know the man watching her from the corner booth was Dominic Kane, a billionaire with blood on his past and enemies still breathing in the dark. But when Grace smiled at him like he was human, not a monster, something inside him broke. This is not just a love story. It's about poverty, power, guilt, redemption, and the kind of love that can either save a man or destroy a woman. Stay until the end, and if this story pulls you in, like the video and comment where you're watching from. Before the midnight rain, before the envelope marked with a crow, before Grace Miller learned that one honest smile could make her dangerous, there was only the morning shift at Crescent Harbor Diner. The day began in the blue hour before sunrise, when New Orleans still looked half asleep, and the Mississippi River breathed fog against the old brick warehouses. A streetcar bell rang somewhere far off, soft and lonely. Down near the Bywater edge, where the pavement cracked from heat and age, the neon sign over Crescent Harbor Diner flickered against the darkness. Crescent Harbor. Then the last two letters blinked out. Crescent Harb. Grace stood beneath that broken sign with a paper cup of gas station coffee in one hand and her purse tucked tight beneath her arm. The air smelled like wet concrete river mud and yesterday's fryer grease leaking from the diner vents. Her feet already hurt and her shift had not even started. She pushed her shoulder against the front door because the frame always stuck when the weather was damp. The bell above the door gave a weak little jangle like it was tired too. Inside the diner waited in shadows. It was not beautiful. It had not been beautiful in years, maybe decades. The booths were faded red vinyl split at the corners. The floor tiles were black and white, but so worn that the white had turned the color of old paper. A long counter ran along the left side, its chrome edge scratched by 1,000 coffee cups, elbows, keys, and impatient hands. Above the grill window, a clock shaped like a smiling moon had stopped at 3:17, and no one had bothered fixing it. Grace loved it anyway. She set her purse in the small employee cubby behind the counter and tied her apron around her waist. The apron used to be white, but now it carried the soft gray of too many wash cycles and too many bad mornings. She pulled her dark blonde hair into a ponytail, checked that her name tag was straight, then turned on the coffee machine. It coughed, hissed, and rattled like an old man waking up angry. Grace patted the side of it. "Come on, sweetheart. Don't quit before I do." From the kitchen, June Hart's voice cut through the steam. "If that machine quits, I'm joining it." Grace smiled for the first time that morning. June appeared through the swinging door with a dish towel over one shoulder and a pencil tucked behind her ear. She was in her late 50s, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and built like someone who could survive a hurricane by insulting it into changing direction. Her gray hair was pinned under a net, but loose curls had already escaped around her temples. "You sleep?" June asked. Grace lifted the coffee pot and watched the first dark stream drip into the glass. Some is what people say when the answer is no. I slept enough to not pour coffee into the sugar jar. That bar is lower than I'd like. Grace reached for the stack of mugs under the counter. A tiny blue crack ran through the handle of the first one. She turned it so customers would not see. June noticed. She always noticed. "You eat breakfast?" Grace did not look up. "I will." When someone forgets to pick up their toast." June grunted and disappeared back into the kitchen. A minute later, she returned with half a biscuit wrapped in a napkin and dropped it beside the register. "Kitchen made extra." Grace gave her a look. "The kitchen is you. And I am extra. Eat." Grace wanted to say she was fine. She wanted to refuse because pride was sometimes the only thing poor people could still own. But her stomach had been empty since yesterday afternoon, and the smell of butter was too much. She took a bite. June pretended not to see how fast she swallowed. By 6:20, the first regular arrived. Mrs. Evelyn Tate came in wearing a lavender coat, white gloves, and the same pearl earrings she wore every day, except Sundays, when she wore the bigger pearls because church deserved effort. She was 78, maybe older, though Grace had learned never to ask. Mrs. Tate moved slowly but with purpose, like the whole city had agreed to wait for her. "Morning, Grace." "Morning, Mrs. Tate." Window booth. As if I'd sit anywhere else. Grace helped her out of her coat and brought her black coffee with 2 creams on the side, even though Mrs. Tate always asked for them after pretending she was going to drink it plain. The old woman opened her crossword puzzle. "Any news worth knowing?" Grace asked. Mrs. Tate peered over her glasses. "Depends. You want truth or comfort?" "At 6:30 in the morning. Comfort, then. The Saints might win this week." Grace laughed. Walter Price arrived next, pushing through the door with his cap low over his forehead and rain on his jacket. He was a retired dock worker with a bad knee, thick hands, and a permanent look of suspicion, as if every new thing in the world had personally offended him. He took his seat at the counter without asking. Grace poured his coffee. "Eggs over easy bacon crisp, no tomato." Walter nodded. "You remembered. I always remember. That's why you're wasted here," June shouted from the kitchen. "She is not wasted. She is underpaid. There's a difference." Walter lifted his mug toward the kitchen. "Underpaid people are wasted people." "You want philosophy?" June called back. "Go bother a college professor." Grace moved through the diner with the practiced rhythm of someone who had trained her body to keep going even when her mind was tired. Coffee poured. Plates landed. Orders went in. Ketchup bottles were wiped clean. Sugar jars were refilled. A child at table 3 dropped a spoon, and Grace caught it before it hit the floor, earning a gasp of delight from the child and a tired nod from his mother. Outside, morning loosened over the neighborhood. The old riverfront was waking up. Trucks groaned past. A man swept water from the doorway of a bait shop that had been closed for 3 years, but somehow still had mail delivered to it. Across the street, the windows of Price Hardware were dark. Beside it, a laundromat hummed behind fogged glass. Next to that stood Reed Books, owned by a quiet man named Arthur Reed, who read more than he sold and kept a chair open for anyone who needed somewhere warm to sit. Grace knew every storefront. She knew which awnings leaked. She knew which owners were behind on rent. She knew which windows had been replaced after summer storms and which had simply been taped. This block had held people together for a long time, maybe too long. During the lull between breakfast and lunch, Grace counted her tips behind the counter. 4 singles, 5 quarters. A dime sticky with syrup. She smoothed the bills flat with 2 fingers and tried not to calculate rent again. Calculating did not create money. It only made panic better organized. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down. Overdue payment notice. She turned the screen face down. June saw it from the kitchen doorway. Student loans. Grace slid the phone into her apron pocket. "They're very committed to our relationship. You call them and say what?" "Hi. I'm still broke, but now I'm emotionally tired too." June crossed her arms. "You could go back someday." "To college. Don't say it like I suggested you marry a ghost." Grace wiped the counter harder than necessary. "I left for a reason. You left because your parents died, and grief ate the ground under you. That's a reason, not a life sentence." The words landed gently, but they still hurt. Grace looked toward the window. A delivery truck blocked the river view. "My mother used to say I could do anything if I just kept showing up. She sounds smart. She was. June's face softened. Grace had been 19 when the phone call came. A wet road outside Baton Rouge. A driver who crossed the center line. Her parents gone before she reached the hospital. She had been a sophomore, then studying business because her father said every dream needed a ledger if it wanted to survive. After the funeral, she had gone back to campus for 2 weeks and spent most of that time staring at the same page of the same textbook while nothing entered her head. Then she stopped going. Then the bills started. Then survival became a full-time education. The bell over the door rang again. 2 construction workers came in shaking rain from their jackets and arguing over whether the mayor had ever fixed anything that mattered. Grace moved toward them with menus before they sat down. Work saved her from memory. By 10:15, the diner had settled into its familiar hum. Forks tapped plates. Coffee steamed. June cursed at the grill. Mrs. Tate muttered crossword clues under her breath. Walter complained that the eggs had lost their dignity. Then Arthur Reed from the bookshop stepped in holding a folded paper in one hand. He did not sit. That was the first sign. June came out of the kitchen wiping her hands. "Arthur." He placed the paper on the counter. "I found this taped to my door." Grace leaned closer. It was a notice from a real estate holding company. Legal language filled the page in tight black lines, but Grace understood enough words to feel cold. Property acquisition, lease review, rent adjustment, redevelopment assessment. Walter stood slowly. "No." Arthur's mouth tightened. The hardware store got one too. Laundromat. Barber shop. Maybe everyone. Mrs. Tate lowered her crossword. June picked up the paper and read it twice. Her face did not change, but her fingers creased the edge. Grace watched her. June. June folded the notice carefully. "Nothing we can fix during lunch." That was how Grace knew it was bad. By noon, the block was buzzing with rumors. Customers came in carrying half-truths and fear. Someone said a hotel chain had bought the properties. Someone else said luxury condos. A woman from the laundromat said her cousin's husband knew a man at City Hall who heard that the whole riverfront was being cleared for investors from New York. Walter said if anyone tried to turn Crescent Harbor into a wine bar, he would haunt the place while still alive. June kept moving. Grace kept pouring coffee, but every sound in the diner felt sharper. At 2:30, when the lunch rush faded, June called Grace into the small office behind the kitchen. The room was barely large enough for a desk, a filing cabinet, and 2 people with bad news. A calendar from 3 years ago hung on the wall because the picture was pretty, and June hated waste. June closed the door. Grace's stomach tightened. "The building sold," June said. Grace stared at her. The diner. The whole block. Grace had known it was coming. Some part of her had heard the footsteps before the door opened. Still, the words hit like a hand to the chest. To who, June rubbed her forehead. Kane Development Group. Grace knew the name because everyone in New Orleans knew the name. It was printed on construction fences, charity banners, glass towers, political donations, and news headlines about riverfront renewal. Kane meant money. Kane meant power. Kane meant men in suits standing in front of places where families used to live. Dominic Kane. Grace asked. June gave a humorless laugh. "You know another Kane rich enough to buy a street?" Grace leaned back against the wall. The office felt suddenly too small. "What happens to us I don't know yet. He's coming today. Today, within the hour." Grace looked down at her apron stained with coffee near the pocket. "June, this place looks like it survived a war and lost. It survived worse. It survived breakfast." Grace almost laughed, but June's eyes were wet, and the laugh died. For 45 minutes they cleaned like people trying to scrub fear from the walls. Grace wiped the counter until her wrist ached. She straightened menus with cracked plastic covers. She polished the front window with old newspaper because paper towels left streaks. June baked cinnamon rolls, the only thing on the menu that could make strangers close their eyes after the first bite. The smell filled the diner, warm sugar and butter pushing back against grease and worry. Mrs. Tate refused to leave. Walter refused even louder. Arthur Reed returned with a book under one arm and sat near the window pretending to read while watching the street. At 3:27, a black Cadillac Escalade rolled to the curb. Conversation stopped. Grace stood behind the counter with a coffee pot in her hand. The glass was hot against her palm. A driver stepped out first, then another man from the passenger side. Big, quiet, scanning the sidewalk. Not assistants. Security. Then Dominic Kane emerged. He was taller than Grace expected, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked cut for him alone. He did not hurry. He did not need to. The street seemed to make space around him. He looked young for a man who owned so much, maybe late 30s. But there was something old in the way he carried himself, a stillness that felt practiced, almost dangerous. Grace had seen wealthy men before. New Orleans had plenty of them. Men who wore linen and smiled too much. Men who spoke to waitresses like they were furniture with legs. Dominic Kane did not smile. He looked at Crescent Harbor Diner the way a surgeon might look at a body on a table. Measured. Exact. Already knowing where the first cut would go. A woman stepped out after him. She wore a cream-colored dress beneath a pale coat, her black hair twisted neatly at the back of her head. Everything about her looked expensive and untouched by weather. Her heels clicked against the sidewalk as if even the puddles were beneath her. Walter muttered, "That's Camille Sterling." Grace glanced at him. Friend of his people like that don't have friends. They have arrangements. The bell over the door rang. Dominic Kane entered Crescent Harbor Diner, and every person inside seemed to hold their breath at once. June stepped forward with the kind of smile people wear when the rent is due and the landlord is early. "Mr. Kane, welcome to Crescent Harbor." Dominic looked at her. "Miss Hart." Grace noticed that he already knew June's name. That small fact made him more frightening than if he had ignored her. Camille lingered near the door, her gaze sweeping the diner with open disapproval. She glanced at the cracked booths, the old counter, the regulars, then at Grace. Her eyes did not stay long. They dismissed quickly. Dominic's eyes did not. They moved across the room once and caught everything. The broken clock, the taped cushion at booth 4, the construction workers pretending not to stare, Mrs. Tate's lifted chin, Walter's clenched jaw, Grace's hand around the coffee pot. June gestured toward the best booth by the window. "Would you like coffee?" "We just made fresh cinnamon rolls." Camille checked her phone. "Dominic, we have the planning call at 4. "I remember." His voice was low and smooth, but there was an edge beneath it, something like steel wrapped in velvet. June turned too fast. "Grace coffee for Mr. Kane." Grace moved before she had time to think. That was the gift of service work. Terror could wait if someone needed coffee. She chose the least chipped mug from the shelf poured from the fresh pot and carried it to the window booth. Dominic sat with his back to the wall. Grace noticed that too. Men who felt safe did not always choose seats that let them see the door. She set the mug down. At the same moment, Dominic reached for it. Their fingers almost touched. He looked up. For 1 second, Grace forgot he was the man who might close the diner. She forgot the suit, the security, the rumors, the woman at the door, the block he had bought like it was a board game. She saw exhaustion, not ordinary tiredness, not the kind a nap could fix. Something deeper. A man surrounded by people and still alone. The realization surprised her so much that her face softened before she could stop it. A small smile came naturally quiet and human. "Careful," she said. "It's hotter than it tastes." Dominic paused. His gaze held hers. "That sounds like a warning. Around here it's customer service." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough to change him. For the briefest moment, the hard lines of his face loosened. He looked less like a man who bought buildings and more like someone who remembered being hungry. Grace stepped back, unsettled by the feeling that something had passed between them without permission. Camille saw it. Grace knew she saw it because the woman's expression cooled by a degree. June began talking quickly about the diner's history, the community, the regular customers, the breakfast crowd, the cinnamon rolls, the way the neighborhood depended on places where people could still sit down without needing a reservation or a credit card with a high limit. Dominic listened. That was worse than indifference. He listened as if he understood and might still destroy it. Grace retreated behind the counter, but she kept looking toward the booth. Dominic asked questions. Exact questions. Lease terms, staff numbers, average daily revenue, equipment age, repair costs, foot traffic. June answered as best she could, her voice steady except when it was not. Mrs. Tate watched with her hands folded over her crossword. Walter did not drink his coffee. The construction workers left cash on the table and slipped out quietly as if grief had entered and they did not know how to sit with it. After 20 minutes, Camille stepped forward. Dominic. He glanced at his watch. I need 5 more minutes. You said that 15 minutes ago. Then I need 5 honest ones. Camille's mouth tightened. Dominic stood. Ms. Hart, may we speak privately? June looked toward Grace. For a moment, Grace saw fear in her manager's face, bare and unguarded. Then June nodded. My office is in back. As Dominic followed her past the counter, he paused near Grace. Only for a second. His eyes met hers again. There was no smile this time, only curiosity, and something like regret. Then he walked into the back with June and the kitchen door swung closed behind them. The diner erupted in whispers. Walter leaned over the counter. You all right? Grace blinked. Why wouldn't I be? Because a wolf just looked at you like he heard music. Grace frowned. That's ridiculous. Maybe. I'm old, not blind. Mrs. Tate spoke without looking up from her puzzle. Powerful men are most dangerous when they're lonely. Grace turned toward her. Mrs. Tate filled in a word with careful strokes. 7 letters. Trouble. Grace tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out thin. In the back office, voices rose and fell. Dominic's stayed low. June's cracked once, then disappeared. Grace wiped the same section of counter until the old laminate shone dull beneath her hand. When the office door opened, June came out first. Her eyes were dry. That somehow made it worse. Dominic followed his expression unreadable. Camille was already at the front door, irritated and waiting. June did not look at anyone. Dominic stopped near the register. Thank you for the coffee, Grace. He said her name as if he had tested it silently before speaking. Grace's fingers tightened on the rag. You're welcome, Mr. Kane. He held her gaze a moment longer. Then Camille opened the door. The bell rang, and the rich, dangerous world that had entered Crescent Harbor Diner swept back out into the wet afternoon. For a while, no one moved. June stood in the middle of the diner with her hands at her sides. Grace walked to her slowly. June. June took a breath. Then another. We close in 2 weeks. Mrs. Tate made a small sound. Walter cursed under his breath. Grace felt the room tilt, but she did not fall. June continued, voice rough. He is offering severance. 3 months for full-time staff, 1 month for part-time. He said it is more than the contract requires. Walter stood. The contract can go to hell. June looked at him. I know. Grace stared out the window at the black Escalade pulling away from the curb. Dominic did not look back. Camille did not look at the diner at all. 3 months' pay. It sounded large until Grace measured it against rent food bills overdue. Notices the debt sitting on her life like a hand around her throat. The diner around her blurred. She heard Mrs. Tate crying softly. Walter promising June that people would fight this. Arthur Reed saying redevelopment had taken his uncle's store in another city and left nothing but a plaque. June telling everyone they would open tomorrow because people still needed breakfast. Grace nodded when she was supposed to nod. Poured coffee when someone asked. Cleaned the booth Dominic had used, though his cup was nearly full. The coffee had gone cold. She carried it to the sink and poured it out. That night Grace walked home through streets slick with rain and reflected neon. Her apartment was on the second floor of an old building with peeling green paint and a stairwell that smelled like bleached cigarettes and damp plaster. She unlocked her door, stepped inside, and stood in the dark without turning on the light. Her room was small, a narrow bed, a second-hand couch, a tiny kitchen, a stack of unpaid bills held down by a chipped mug. On the refrigerator, a photo of her parents smiled under a magnet shaped like a crawfish. Grace touched the edge of the photo. "I might lose the diner," she whispered. Her mother's frozen smile offered no answer. Grace sat on the couch and took off her shoes. Red marks curved across her heels. She pressed her thumb into one and winced. The city outside kept moving. Music somewhere down the block. A siren in the distance. Rainwater slipping through a broken gutter. Grace thought of Dominic Kane's eyes when she smiled at him. Then she hated herself for thinking of him at all. The next 3 days passed under a low ceiling of dread. Crescent Harbor opened each morning like nothing had changed, but everything had. Customers came not just to eat, but to mourn early. Mrs. Tate stayed longer than usual. Walter started a petition and bullied half the block into signing it. Arthur Reed packed his rare books in cardboard boxes, though he told everyone he was only organizing. June worked harder than anyone. She joked louder, snapped faster, burned her hand on a pan and did not cry until she thought no one could see. Grace saw. She said nothing. On the fourth morning, fog hung low over the street. Grace arrived at 6:15 and found June already inside, sitting alone in the corner booth with the lights off. June. The older woman looked up. For the first time since Grace had known her, June looked lost. "I keep thinking I should be relieved," June said. "No more fighting broken freezers. No more begging vendors for another week. No more wondering if payroll clears." Grace slid into the booth across from her. "But you're not." June shook her head. "This place held my life together after my husband left, held yours together after your parents, held half this neighborhood together when the rest of the city forgot we were here." Grace swallowed. "I don't know what I'll do without it." June reached across the table and took her hand. "You'll live. That's the first job. Everything else comes after." They sat like that until the first customer arrived. Near 10, while Grace was refilling sugar jars, the bell over the door rang. She looked up by habit. Dominic Kane stood in the doorway. This time he was alone. No Camille. No security visible. No charcoal suit. He wore dark jeans, a black sweater, and a coat damp at the shoulders from the fog. He looked less polished this way, but not less powerful. If anything, the lack of formality made the danger feel closer to the skin. Conversation thinned into silence. Walter's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. June emerged from the kitchen and froze. Dominic's eyes found Grace first. Grace Miller. Her name and his voice felt too intimate for a room full of witnesses. Grace set down the sugar jar. "Yes, I would like to speak with you." June moved beside her. "She's working." Dominic looked at June, respectful but unmoved. "I understand. Then you can understand coming back another time. It cannot wait." Grace felt every person in the diner watching her. She lifted her chin. "If this is about the closure, you should talk to June." Dominic's gaze returned to her. "It is not about the closure." A beat passed. His voice lowered. "It is personal." The word moved through the diner like a match touched to paper. Grace should have said no. She should have stayed behind the counter, kept both hands on the safe, ordinary world that was already slipping away. But curiosity had always been a dangerous kind of hunger, and Dominic Kane had walked into Crescent Harbor carrying answers she was suddenly afraid to want. June touched her arm. "You don't have to." Grace looked at the man by the door, the man who had bought the block, the man whose eyes had changed when she smiled at him. The man everyone feared standing in her dying diner as if he had come to confess something he did not know how to say. "It's okay," Grace said. She untied her apron slowly, laid it on the counter, and walked toward the back booth where the old vinyl seat sighed beneath them, and whatever Dominic Kane had brought with him waited in the silence between them. The back booth had always been Grace's favorite place to hide during slow hours. From there, she could see the whole diner without being seen too clearly herself. She could watch Mrs. Tate work through her crossword by the window, Walter argue with the newspaper. June paced between the kitchen and the counter like a general defending the last wall of a city. The vinyl seat was cracked near the edge, and one corner of the table rocked if someone leaned too hard on it, but to Grace it had always felt safe. It did not feel safe with Dominic Kane sitting across from her. He took up space without trying. His shoulders filled the booth. His hands rested on the table still and controlled the hands of a man who had learned long ago never to reveal tension unless he meant to use it. Up close, he looked less like a headline and more like a wound someone had taught to wear expensive clothes. Grace folded her hands in her lap so he would not see them tremble. "You said this was personal," she said. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. "I did. Then talk." A faint flicker touched his mouth. Not quite amusement. Not quite approval. Most people try to soften their voice with me. Most people probably want something from you. And you don't. Grace glanced around the diner. June stood near the coffee machine, pretending to check cups. Walter watched openly. Mrs. Tate had abandoned her crossword entirely. Grace looked back at Dominic. "I want my job back. I want this place to stay open. I want my rent paid and my phone to stop buzzing with overdue notices. I want a lot of things, Mr. Kane. I'm just not foolish enough to think you came here to give them to me." Dominic absorbed that without offense. "Dominic," he said. "What? If we are going to have an honest conversation, call me Dominic." Grace almost laughed. "An honest conversation with the man closing my diner? That sounds ambitious." "It is." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed a business card on the table. Thick black paper, silver lettering. No decoration. Just a name, a company, and a number that looked too direct to be handed out casually. Grace did not touch it. Dominic noticed. "I am building a new riverfront development," he said. "Residential units, commercial space, public walkways, restaurants, offices." "Congratulations. Do you always answer opportunity like it insulted your mother? Only when opportunity knocks after buying the building." This time he did smile. It was small and brief, but it changed his face in a way Grace did not like because it made him harder to hate. "I want to open a cafe on the ground floor," Dominic said. "Not a chain, not a showroom with coffee machines, a real place. A place with regulars, a place that earns loyalty." Grace stared at him. "You bought Crescent Harbor to destroy it, and now you want to build a prettier version with better lighting." "No. That is exactly what you just described. I want to build something that survives." Grace leaned forward. "This place survived." Dominic's eyes moved past her for a second, taking in the room. "No," he said quietly. "This place endured. There is a difference." The words struck harder than she expected. She hated him for saying them because some part of her knew he was right. Crescent Harbor had not been thriving. It had been holding its breath. Dominic looked back at her. "The roof needs replacing. The electrical system is not up to code. The kitchen equipment is failing. Your lease is exposed to a rent adjustment the current owner delayed twice before selling." If I had not bought this block, someone else would have. They might not have offered severance. They might not have cared who got pushed out. Grace's jaw tightened. So I'm supposed to be grateful that you're destroying us politely, no? Good. I am asking you to help me keep the part that matters. Grace's mouth went dry. Dominic slid the card an inch closer. I want you to manage the new cafe. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. The sounds of the diner seemed to grow distant. The hiss of the coffee machine, a chair leg scraping, rain tapping against the window, June breathing too loudly behind the counter. Grace looked at him, waiting for the cruel part. It did not come. I'm sorry, she said slowly. You want me to what? Manage it. I carry plates for a living. You carry more than plates. You don't know anything about me. I know you noticed Mrs. Tate's hands shaking before she asked for help opening her creamer. I know Walter gets toast he never orders because you pretend the kitchen made a mistake. I know you knew which mug had a cracked handle and turned it away from me before you poured coffee. I know you smiled at me when everyone else in this room had already decided I was something to fear. Grace felt heat rise in her face. That smile was not an interview. No, Dominic said. It was the only honest thing that happened to me that day. She looked away first, angry that her own body betrayed her with a quickened heartbeat. You are offering me a job because I smiled at you. I am offering you a job because that smile made me pay attention. What I saw after that is why I came back. Grace shook her head. This is insane. It is unconventional. It is insane. You will be trained. I have 18 months of waitress experience and half a college education. Then we begin there. You talk like people can just begin over whenever they want. Dominic's expression shifted. Something shadowed moved under his control. Some people have to. Grace heard more in the answer than the words carried, but he did not explain. She picked up the business card at last. It was heavier than it looked. What is the catch? No catch. There is always a catch. The catch is that you will work harder than you have ever worked. Eleanor Mercer. My operations director is not gentle. You will learn hospitality management staff, scheduling inventory systems, payroll vendor contracts, local hiring compliance cost control, and how to sit in meetings with people who will underestimate you before you speak. Grace stared at him. That sounds awful. It often is. And you think I can do that? I think you already do difficult things every day for almost nothing? The answer was too clean, too direct. It found a bruise inside her and pressed. Grace set the card back down. If I say no, then I wish you well and make another hire. You just walk away. Yes. No pressure. His gaze lowered to the card, then returned to her. Grace, poverty is pressure. I do not need to add to it. She hated that too. Hated that he could name her cage so easily. Dominic stood. The movement made Walter shift at the counter. Dominic noticed but ignored it. My office will send details. Salary, benefits, signing bonus. Read them before you decide. Grace rose too. Why do you care whether people have a place to sit? Dominic paused. For the first time since they entered the booth, his control seemed imperfect. Because I remember what it felt like not to have one. He left the card on the table and walked toward the door. Before stepping out, he looked back once. Not at the diner. At Grace. Then the bell rang and he was gone. The room exhaled. June reached Grace first. What did he want? Grace looked down at the card. The silver letters seemed to glow against the black paper. He offered me a job. Walter barked a laugh. Doing what, guarding the door? Managing his new cafe. No one spoke. June's face changed slowly, surprise first, then worry, then something Grace could not name. Mrs. Tate crossed herself. Walter stared toward the window. That man does not give gifts. Grace closed her fingers around the card. I know. She worked the rest of her shift in a fog. Every task felt strange. Pouring coffee, clearing plates, refilling napkins, smiling at customers who asked if the rumors were true. The same body doing the same work while some impossible door stood open in the back of her mind. At closing, June locked the front door and turned the sign around. The diner sank into the blue quiet that came after customers left. Grace wiped the counter, though it was already clean. June came out of the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She set one in front of Grace. "Sit." Grace sat. June took the stool beside her. "How much I don't know yet, but enough to scare you." Grace gave a weak laugh. "Everything about him scares me." June stared into her coffee. "Good. Fear keeps people from mistaking wolves for dogs." Grace turned the card over between her fingers. "He said Crescent Harbor was enduring, not surviving." June's face tightened. "I hate him for being right." Grace looked at her. "You think I should say no?" June did not answer right away. Outside, a car passed its headlights, sliding across the windows and disappearing. "I think you should listen before you refuse," June said. Grace blinked. "I thought you'd be angry." "I am angry." "I'm angry he bought the block. I'm angry this place is closing. I'm angry I have to pretend 3 months of severance is mercy. But I'm not angry that someone looked at you and saw more than a tired girl with a coffee pot." Grace's throat tightened. "June. No. Let me say it." June turned on the stool to face her fully. "I've watched you shrink yourself to fit inside what life left you. You count quarters like they are weather reports. You skip meals and call it being busy. You talk about college like it belongs to someone who died with your parents." Grace looked away, but June reached over and took her hand. "This diner saved you once," June said. "That does not mean you have to die with it." Grace pressed her lips together. "It feels like betrayal. Then make it not betrayal. Make something out of it. Make him keep his promises." The next night, Grace sat alone in her apartment with Dominic Kane's business card beside her phone. Her room smelled faintly of rain and old radiator heat. The ceiling fan clicked every 7 seconds. Across the hall, someone's television played too loudly through the wall. Grace had reheated soup in a dented pot but had not touched it. Her phone rang at 8:15. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. Then she answered. Grace Miller. A woman's voice, polished and professional, came through. "Miss Miller, this is Rebecca Vale calling from Kane Development Group on behalf of Mr. Dominic Kane. He asked that I provide formal details regarding the position discussed with you." Grace sat straighter. "I haven't accepted anything." "Of course. This is informational only." Informational only sounded safe. Nothing that followed felt safe. The position was general manager of the Future Cafe located in Kane Riverfront Square. Starting salary, $82,000 annually. Full medical, dental, and vision. 4 weeks paid vacation. Retirement contributions. Performance bonus eligibility. Paid training period. Grace gripped the phone. Then Rebecca continued. "A signing bonus of $30,000 will be issued upon acceptance intended to support transition expenses." Grace stopped breathing. $30,000. The number entered the room like a stranger. She looked around her apartment at the cracked window lock, the sink with the slow leak, the stack of bills under the chipped mug. "Miss Miller," Rebecca asked. "I'm here. Mr. Kane understands this is a significant decision. He asked that you take 72 hours to consider. After that, we will need to continue the hiring process if you decline." Grace swallowed. "Did he tell you to say that?" "He said you might overthink until the decision became fear wearing a responsible coat." Grace almost smiled despite herself. "That sounds like him." After the call ended, Grace opened her banking app. $217.43. She stared at the number until her vision blurred. Then she opened her laptop and searched Dominic Kane. The public version was everywhere. Dominic Kane, self-made developer. Dominic Kane, philanthropist. Dominic Kane, visionary behind multiple riverfront revitalization projects. Dominic Kane, donor to schools, clinics, housing programs. In the photos, he stood beside governors, mayors, hospital boards, children cutting ribbons outside new community centers. He looked composed in every image, handsome and distant, like a man allowing himself to be photographed but never captured. Grace kept scrolling. Older articles surfaced. A federal inquiry into Kane Freight that never resulted in charges. Rumors about dockside unions. Witnesses who changed testimony. Contracts connected to shell companies. A burned warehouse that insurance investigators called suspicious before the story disappeared from local news. One headline made her hand still on the trackpad. Dominic Kane, savior of the riverfront, or ghost of the old underworld. Grace clicked it. Most of the article was careful. Too careful. It described speculation, alleged associations, unnamed sources, and the long history of organized crime along Gulf shipping routes. Dominic had never been convicted. Dominic had never been formally charged. Dominic had never publicly addressed the claims. Grace closed the laptop. The room felt colder. She walked to the refrigerator and touched the photo of her parents. Her mother wore a yellow summer dress. Her father had one arm around her shoulder, grinning as if nothing bad had ever learned their names. "What am I supposed to do?" Grace whispered. The apartment gave her the same answer it always did. Silence. The next morning, she told June everything. The salary, the benefits, the signing bonus, the articles, the fear. June listened without interrupting. When Grace finished, June turned back to the grill and flipped 3 pancakes. "That's a lot of money," she said. "It feels like blood money." June slid the pancakes onto a plate. Maybe. Or maybe money is only blood money if you let it buy your silence. Grace frowned. What does that mean? It means if you take it, you do not become his decoration. You do not become his grateful charity case. You make him answer questions. You make him build the place he promised. You make room for the people he is pushing out. Grace leaned against the counter. "And if he is dangerous," June looked at her, "then be careful. That's your advice. That is always my advice. Be careful. Be smart. Do not confuse charm with character. Do not confuse money with safety. And do not say no to your life because you are afraid someone will think you forgot where you came from." Grace's eyes burned. "I don't want you to think that." June wiped her hands and came around the counter. "I think you are 22 years old and tired in ways you are too young to be. I think your parents did not raise you to survive on stale biscuits and pride. I think if a door opens, you walk through with your eyes open and your shoulders back." Grace laughed softly, though tears slipped down her cheeks. "I'm scared." "Good," June said, pulling her into a hug. "Brave people usually are." 2 days later, Grace stood in the lobby of Kane Tower wearing the only black dress she owned and a blazer she had bought on sale the night before. The fabric still had stiff creases from the store hanger. Her purse strap was fraying near the buckle, so she held that side against her hip. The lobby rose around her in glass and marble. Everything gleamed. Even the silence seemed expensive. A security guard checked her name. A receptionist with perfect hair gave her a visitor badge. "Ms. Miller, 15th floor. Ms. Mercer is expecting you." The elevator doors closed around Grace. Her reflection stared back from polished metal. She looked like a girl pretending to be a woman, pretending not to be afraid. On the 15th floor, Eleanor Mercer waited near the elevator bank. She was in her 50s, with silver hair cut sharply at her jaw and eyes that looked capable of finding a mistake in a locked drawer. Her navy suit fit perfectly. She carried a leather folder and no visible patience. Grace Miller. Yes, ma'am. Eleanor's gaze moved over her once. Not insulting. Not kind. Exact. Mr. Kane sees potential in you. Grace lifted her chin. So I keep hearing. Something like approval passed through Eleanor's eyes. Potential is common. Discipline is not. Follow me. Grace followed her through a corridor of glass offices and quiet people. No one raised their voice. No one hurried. It made Grace miss June shouting over the grill. Eleanor opened a conference room door. Inside were binders, a laptop, a legal pad, and a cup of coffee waiting at one seat. Grace stopped. Eleanor noticed. Problem number 1. I just expected more people. You are not ready for more people. Grace sat. Eleanor placed the leather folder in front of her. Over the next 6 weeks, you will learn the operational structure of a high-volume hospitality business. Inventory management staff, training, vendor negotiation, scheduling, basic accounting, customer retention, compliance, conflict handling, and brand culture. Grace stared at the folder. That is a lot. That is an understatement. I might fail. Yes. Grace looked up. Eleanor did not soften. You will fail repeatedly. Your value will depend on whether you correct quickly or defend poorly. Grace breathed in through her nose. Understood. For the next 4 hours, Eleanor walked her through documents that made Grace's head ache. Cost percentages, payroll projections, seating turnover, vendor minimums, labor laws, insurance requirements, food safety audits. Grace wrote until her hand cramped. At noon, Dominic appeared in the doorway. The room changed before Grace looked up. She felt it in Eleanor's posture, in the silence outside in the air. Dominic wore a dark suit today, no tie. His eyes moved from Eleanor to the open binder to Grace's ink-stained fingers. How is she doing? Eleanor answered before Grace could. She asks questions before pretending to understand. That is promising. Dominic looked at Grace. And how are you doing? Grace considered lying. Then she looked at the binder. I feel like someone handed me the controls to an airplane because I once noticed a window seat was loose. Dominic smiled. Good. That was not a joke. I know. Eleanor closed the binder. We are finished for today. She has reading. Grace looked at the stack. All of that Eleanor's expression did not change. You accepted the job, Miss Miller, not the fantasy of it. Grace gathered the binders into her arms. Dominic stepped aside as she reached the door. For a second, they stood close enough for her to catch the faint scent of his cologne cedar smoke and something clean beneath it. You came, he said quietly. Grace met his eyes. I did. Do you regret it? I haven't been here long enough. His mouth curved. Fair. Grace shifted the binders against her chest. But I have conditions. Dominic's expression sharpened with interest. Name them. The cafe cannot price out the people from Crescent Harbor. Former staff should get interview priority. There needs to be a table where people can sit without being pushed out for not spending enough. And I report to Ms. Mercer during training, not directly to you. Eleanor behind them went very still. Dominic looked at Grace for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Done. Grace blinked. All of it. You said them like requirements, not requests. They are. Then done. Eleanor stepped forward. I will draft the reporting structure. Dominic's eyes remained on Grace. Anything else, Grace thought of Camille's cold gaze, the old articles, the headline about ghosts. Yes, she said. If there is something about you that can hurt this project, I want to know before it touches me." For the first time, Dominic did not answer quickly. The pause was small, but Grace felt it. "There are things in my past," he said. "That is not an answer." "No," he said. "It is the beginning of one." Grace held his gaze, waiting. Dominic looked away first toward the windows overlooking the river. Not here. Eleanor's face had gone unreadable. Grace hugged the binders tighter. Then someday soon. Dominic turned back. Yes. Grace did not know whether to believe him, but she walked out of the room with her shoulders straight. That evening, as she rode the bus home with binders stacked on her lap and rain streaking the windows, Grace passed the old riverfront block. Crescent Harbor's neon sign flickered weakly in the dusk. For the first time, she did not look away. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and watched the diner disappear behind her. In her purse, Dominic Kane's business card rested beside her apartment keys. It no longer felt like a gift. It felt like a door. And Grace knew as the bus carried her deeper into the city that some doors did not open quietly. Some opened with the sound of locks breaking. The door Grace had chosen did not open quietly. It opened with binders stacked on her kitchen table, coffee gone cold beside her elbow, and the city outside her window breathing rain against the glass. For 3 nights, she read until the words blurred. Vendor contracts, labor cost projections, sanitation rules, training schedules. She wrote notes in the margins with a pen she had borrowed from Crescent Harbor and forgotten to return. By the end of the first week, she had learned that running a cafe was not the same as loving one. Loving a place was easy when someone else worried about invoices, payroll, broken pipes, spoiled milk. Late employees, angry vendors, and customers who wanted warmth without paying enough to keep the lights on. Running a place meant putting numbers beside feelings and refusing to let either one lie. Eleanor Mercer did not make that lesson gentle. On Monday morning, she placed a spreadsheet in front of Grace and said, "Tell me why this cafe loses money in month 3. Grace stared at the columns until they seemed to move. The rent wrong. Labor closer. Grace swallowed and tried again. The menu prices are too low for the projected staffing model. Eleanor tapped one red fingernail against the paper. Now tell me how to fix it without turning the cafe into a luxury trap that no one from the old neighborhood can afford. Grace looked up. Eleanor's face was sharp and still, but there was something hidden behind her eyes. Not kindness. Expectation. Grace picked up the pen. We change staffing by hour instead of by day. More people during breakfast and lunch, fewer in the dead time. We keep basic coffee low and make the margin on specialty drinks, pastries, and office catering. And we offer a neighborhood card for regulars from the old block. Eleanor was quiet. Grace waited for the cut. Instead, Eleanor gave one brief nod. Better. It felt ridiculous how much that one word mattered. Grace carried it back to her apartment like a coin in her pocket. Crescent Harbor Diner closed on a Sunday. The morning was gray with a low sky that pressed against the windows. People came in slowly, as if arriving at a funeral where the body was a building and the mourners were hungry for one last memory. Mrs. Tate wore her bigger pearls. Walter came in a clean shirt. Arthur Reed brought an old photograph of the riverfront from the 1970s. The docks crowded with men in work boots and women standing outside shops that no longer existed. June taped the photograph behind the counter above the coffee machine. Grace worked the floor alone by choice. She wanted to remember the weight of the coffee pot, the tug of the apron string around her waist, the sound of plates sliding across the counter. She wanted to remember June shouting from the kitchen and Walter complaining that the bacon had lost its nerve. She wanted to remember Mrs. Tate asking for more cream even though Grace had already placed it beside her cup. Near closing, June brought out cinnamon rolls for everyone. No one spoke for a while. The coffee was bitter. The chairs wobbled. The sign outside flickered weakly through the afternoon rain. Everyone stayed. When the last cup was empty, June locked the door and rested her forehead against the glass. Grace stood beside her, unable to move. "I'll keep something of it alive," Grace said. June did not look at her. "Do not keep the furniture, honey. Keep the feeling." Grace nodded because if she tried to answer, she would break. The weeks that followed were a blur of construction dust, morning meetings, training sessions, and arguments held in rooms where the air smelled like new carpet and expensive coffee. The new cafe existed first as drawings on a table, then as exposed beams and concrete floors, then as a shape Grace could walk through wearing a hard hat that slid too low over her eyes. The space was beautiful. That was the problem. It had tall windows facing the river and ceilings high enough to make every voice rise. Brass fixtures caught the light. The floor was polished concrete. The walls were smooth, clean, and empty. Grace stood in the middle of it one afternoon with Noah Reed, the architect, and frowned. "It looks like a place people photograph before they leave." Noah blinked. Dominic, standing near the window, turned slowly. Grace looked around. "It is too perfect." Noah folded his arms. "Perfect is usually considered good, not if you want people to stay." Grace walked toward the corner where sunlight pooled on the floor. Crescent Harbor was ugly, but it let people breathe. Nobody felt like they had to be impressive before sitting down. Dominic watched her carefully. Grace pointed to the open floor plan. "We need a corner booth by the window, not the best table for profit. The best table for someone who comes every morning and wants to feel remembered. For Mrs. Tate," Dominic said. Grace looked at him. He remembered. She hated how much that warmed her. "Yes," she said. "For Mrs. Tate." Noah made a note. Grace moved toward the center of the room. "And a long table here. Community style. Big enough for students' book clubs, people who came alone but do not want to feel alone." Dominic stepped closer. And Walter Grace smiled despite herself. "Walter needs a counter seat where he can insult the food and still see the door." Noah laughed. Dominic did not, but his eyes changed. Over the next month, Grace fought for details that other people considered small. Hooks beneath the counter for purses. A bulletin board near the back for neighborhood notices. Basic drip coffee priced low enough that Walter would complain but still buy it. Free refills for seniors before 10 in the morning. Hiring interviews for former Crescent Harbor staff before anyone else. Camille Sterling hated all of it. She attended one meeting in a white suit and sat with crossed legs while Grace explained the neighborhood card program. "Sentiment is expensive," Camille said. Grace looked at her across the conference table. "So is emptiness." A man from finance coughed into his hand. Camille smiled. "This project serves a higher income clientele. This cafe sits in a neighborhood with a memory," Grace said. "If we erase that, people will feel it even if they cannot name it." Camille turned to Dominic. "Are we building a business or a shrine?" Dominic leaned back in his chair. "Grace is building a business people might love. That is harder than building one people merely use." Camille's smile stayed, but it sharpened. After the meeting, Grace found her in the hallway near the elevator. Camille was applying lipstick in the reflection of a dark window. "You are better at this than I expected," Camille said. Grace stopped. Was that meant to sound like praise? It was meant to sound accurate. Grace adjusted the folder against her chest. "Then, thank you." Camille closed the lipstick with a soft click. Dominic has a weakness for wounded things. Broken neighborhoods, failing businesses, pretty girls with sad eyes. Grace's fingers tightened around the folder. "I am not one of his projects." No, Camille turned toward her. "Then be careful you do not become his confession. Men like Dominic Kane do not fall in love like ordinary men. They reach for salvation and call it desire." Grace held her gaze. "And women like you call cruelty wisdom because it sounds better." Camille's face cooled. Do not mistake being chosen for being safe." Grace walked away before Camille could see that the words had landed. That night, Grace found Dominic at the unfinished cafe, standing alone in the dark while construction lamps threw long shadows across the floor. He had removed his suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled to his forearms. Dust marked one shoulder. Without the tower, the boardroom, and the men who moved when he moved, he looked almost real. "Do billionaires usually haunt drywall?" Grace asked. Dominic turned. "Only when the drywall is behind schedule." She walked toward him. "You approved the neighborhood card. You made a good case. I made that case 3 times before you agreed. I enjoy consistency. You enjoy winning." His mouth curved. "Yes." Grace studied him in the dim light. "Camille thinks I am a mistake. Camille thinks compassion is a leak in the roof. That is not a denial." Dominic looked toward the windows. Beyond them, the river was a black ribbon under the city lights. "My mother cleaned offices 2 streets from here," he said. "My father unloaded cargo on the docks until his back gave out. Men with money decided when we ate, where we lived, who got moved, who got forgotten." Grace stood beside him. "So, you became the man with money." His voice lowered. "I became worse first." The words settled between them. Grace wanted to ask. She had promised herself she would ask, but the look on his face stopped her. Not because she was afraid of him, because he looked for one rare second afraid of himself. She turned back toward the empty room. "Then build better than they did." Dominic looked at her. Grace kept her eyes on the future cafe. "That is what you said you wanted." The opening of Second Light Cafe came on a bright Saturday in spring. By 7 in the morning, a line had formed outside. Grace stood behind the counter with her hands wrapped around a clean white mug, watching through the glass as people gathered under the new sign. The letters were gold against deep green paint. Simple. Warm. Nothing like the broken neon of Crescent Harbor, but not cold either. June had come back for the opening wearing a blue dress and pretending she had not cried in the parking lot. "You ready?" she asked. Grace breathed in. The cafe smelled like fresh coffee, cinnamon, polished wood, and rain carried in on coats. "No." June smiled. "Good. Ready people get careless." Grace unlocked the door. Mrs. Tate entered first. She walked slowly to the corner booth by the window. Her gloved hand touched the back of the seat. She looked at the river, then at Grace. "Well," she said. "This will do." Grace laughed through the tightness in her throat. Walter came next and sat at the counter. He eyed the menu like it had insulted his ancestors. $3 for coffee. Grace crossed her arms. "You paid $2.75 at Crescent Harbor. That was different. How it came with emotional damage." Grace poured him a cup. "First one is on the house." Walter tasted it. His face remained stern. Too smooth. "Is that bad?" "It is suspicious." But he drank half of it before setting the mug down. By noon, the cafe was alive. Students filled the long table with laptops and notebooks. Office workers came in for espresso and left with pastries. Former Crescent Harbor regulars claimed corners and argued about whether the new cinnamon rolls were better or merely different. A mother with a stroller cried quietly when Grace told her the restroom had a changing table because she had never seen one in a place this nice that did not make her feel watched. Dominic arrived after the rush began. He stayed near the back dressed in a dark suit, hands in his pockets, saying little. People noticed him. How could they not? But he did not take up the room. He let the cafe be seen before himself. Grace caught his eye across the crowd. Pride moved through his expression so openly that it made her look away. Later, when the last customer left and the chairs sat crooked across the floor, Grace leaned against the counter, exhausted down to the bone. Dominic picked up a rag and began wiping a table. Grace stared. "What are you doing?" "Cleaning. You know people get paid for that. I have been told." You look expensive doing cheap labor. He glanced at her. Maybe I need the practice. She laughed, and the sound filled the empty cafe with something brighter than the overhead lights. Dominic set the rag down. The air changed. Grace felt it before he spoke. Grace. She turned. He stood a few feet away, close enough to reach her, far enough not to trap her. I have tried to keep this professional. Her heart began to beat harder. Because you are my boss. Yes. Because you changed my life. Yes. Because people would talk. They already do. Grace swallowed. Dominic's face was controlled, but his eyes were not. I have thought about you every day since Crescent Harbor, he said. Not because you were grateful. You were not. Not because you were impressed. You were not. Because you looked at me like there was still a man under all the things people fear. Grace's voice came softer than she intended. Maybe I wanted there to be. He closed his eyes for a second, as if the words cost him. I should walk out. Yes. I should leave you safe. Yes. He opened his eyes. Tell me to. Grace looked at the cafe they had built from the bones of what was lost. She thought of June's hands, Walter's complaints, Mrs. Tate's smile, Camille's warning, Eleanor's quiet concern, and the old headline she had never forgotten. Then she looked at Dominic. I cannot. He crossed the space slowly, giving her every chance to move away. She did not. When he touched her face, his hands were gentle. That surprised her more than the kiss. His thumbs brushed her cheekbones as if she were something precious and breakable, though Grace had spent years proving she was not. The kiss began carefully. Then it deepened. All the weeks of restrained glances, arguments, late meetings, and almost spoken truths broke open at once. Grace gripped his shirt. Dominic made a low sound against her mouth, not triumph, not hunger alone, but relief. When they pulled apart, their foreheads rested together. Grace whispered, This is complicated. Dominic's breath warmed her lips. More than you know. She heard the warning in it. She kissed him again anyway. For several weeks they kept the relationship quiet. Not secret exactly. Secrets felt too much like Dominic's world. Quiet was different. Quiet meant dinners behind private doors, late walks along the river after the cafe closed mornings when Dominic appeared with coffee from Grace's own cafe because he said it was better when she made it, even if someone else had. It meant Grace learning his penthouse had too much glass and not enough warmth. It meant Dominic learning her apartment stairs creaked on the fourth step, and that she always checked the lock twice. It meant Grace falling asleep on his couch with operations reports open on her lap and waking under a blanket she did not remember pulling over herself. It also meant arguments. Dominic sent a car for her one rainy night without asking. Grace refused to get in. He called her. It is pouring. I have an umbrella. It is not safe. You do not get to decide that without me. Silence followed. Then Dominic said, I am trying to protect you, and I am trying to stay a person, not a package you move from place to place. The car left. The next day, Dominic apologized in the cafe kitchen while Grace counted pastry inventory. I am used to solving fear with control, he said. Grace did not look up. That must be lonely. He said nothing. She looked at him then. I am not asking you to stop being afraid. I am asking you not to make me smaller because of it. He nodded. All right. And because he meant it, she forgave him. Eleanor noticed before anyone else. She found Grace one afternoon in the office reviewing payroll. Are you careful with him? Grace looked up. That sounds like a question wearing a knife. It is advice wearing practical shoes. Grace closed the laptop. I know what people think. No, you know the easy version. Billionaire boss. young employee. Pretty scandal. Eleanor stepped inside and closed the door. That is not what worries me. Grace went still. What worries you? Dominic Kane has spent most of his life surviving rooms where softness was punished. He is not cruel, but he is dangerous when cornered. There are parts of him he keeps locked because he believes locks are the same as repentance. Grace thought of the unfinished cafe and his voice saying, I became worse first. Do you know what he did? Eleanor's face did not change. I know enough to tell you this. If he tells you the truth, listen carefully. If he hides it from you, do not confuse love with safety. That evening, Grace closed Second Light later than usual. The street outside was quiet. Rain glazed the pavement and turned the windows dark enough to reflect her own face back at her. She looked older than she had at Crescent Harbor. Not harder exactly, more awake. She finished counting the drawer, turned off the music, and carried 2 mugs to the sink. A black SUV idled across the street. No headlights. Grace paused. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. She picked it up. A photo filled the screen. Grace standing behind the cafe window earlier that day, laughing at something Walter had said. Then a message appeared beneath it. Pretty smile. Kane always did like expensive weaknesses. Grace's hand tightened around the phone. Outside, the SUV pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the wet New Orleans night. Grace stood in the empty cafe with the phone in her hand, staring at the photograph until the screen dimmed. For a moment, she heard nothing except the rain sliding down the windows. The espresso machine had gone quiet. The last busboy had left 20 minutes earlier. Walter's mug sat upside down on a drying mat behind the counter, still warm from the dishwasher. Outside, the black SUV was gone, swallowed by the wet shine of New Orleans night. Grace locked the front door. Then she locked it again. Her thumb hovered over Dominic's name. Pride told her not to call. Fear pressed harder. He answered before the first ring finished. Grace. She had not spoken yet, but he already knew. There was a car outside, she said. Her voice sounded calm in a way that did not belong to her. Black SUV. No headlights. Someone sent me a picture. Dominic went silent. Grace looked at the photo again and felt something cold move through her chest. They called me your expensive weakness. A door closed on Dominic's end. His voice dropped lower. Where are you? At the cafe. Lock the door. I did. Stay away from the windows. I am. Do not leave. Nate is 2 streets away. I am coming. The line ended before she could ask anything else. Grace set the phone on the counter and looked around Second Light. In daylight, it felt warm, a place of voices and spoons and sunlight across polished wood. At night, with rain on the glass and shadows in the corners, it looked like something fragile built in hostile territory. She moved to the small office and turned off the front lights from the panel. The cafe sank into darkness except for the glow above the pastry case. Her reflection appeared in the office window, pale, still eyes too wide. A car door slammed outside. Grace held her breath. Then a familiar knock came against the back entrance. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Nate Holloway. She opened the door with one hand still on the lock. Nate stepped inside, broad-shouldered, and rain darkened his eyes, sweeping past her before they settled on her face. Are you hurt? No. Did anyone approach you? No. Did you touch anything outside? Grace almost laughed. I am a cafe manager, Nate, not a crime scene technician. His expression did not change. Tonight you are both. Dominic arrived 6 minutes later. He entered through the back rain in his hair and fury held so tightly inside him that it made the air feel charged. He wore a black overcoat over a white shirt, no tie, as if he had left wherever he was without finishing the person he had been pretending to be there. His eyes found Grace. Only then did his face shift. Not soften. Break, almost. "Show me." Grace handed him the phone. Dominic read the message once. His jaw tightened. He passed the phone to Nate, then looked back at Grace. "Did the SUV circle more than once? I noticed it once. It could have been there longer." "Dark windows." "Yes. Plates I could not see." Nate was already on his own phone, speaking quietly to someone outside. Grace crossed her arms over her chest. "I need you to stop talking around me." Dominic went still. She pointed toward her phone in Nate's hand. "Someone sent that to me." "Not to you. Me. So I am in this now, whether you wanted that or not." His expression changed again. A flash of pain under the control. "You were never supposed to be." "Then tell me what this is." The rain struck the back door in hard little bursts. Nate lowered his phone and waited near the office entrance, close enough to intervene, far enough to pretend he was not listening. Dominic looked toward the dark front windows. "There are names from my past that should not be spoken casually." Grace's laugh came out thin and bitter. That sounds like something a guilty man says before he decides how much truth to ration. He turned back to her. She held his gaze, though her hands had begun to shake. "Who sent the message I do not know yet. But you have guesses." "Yes." "Then start with the worst one." Dominic was quiet long enough for Grace to feel the answer before he spoke. "Miles Rourke." The name sounded ordinary. 2 syllables. A man could own a hardware store with that name. A man could coach a little league team. But Dominic said it like a gun placed gently on a table. "Who is he?" "A man who built half the illegal shipping routes along the Gulf before the federal government even knew where to look. Drugs, weapons, stolen cargo, protection rackets, political money when it suited him. He does not raise his voice. He does not forgive embarrassment. And he never forgets a debt." Grace swallowed. "And you owe him one?" Dominic looked away. That was answer enough. The cafe seemed to grow colder. Grace stepped back until her hip touched the desk. "You told me there were things in your past." "I did. You did not tell me they could send men to photograph me through my own window." Dominic's hands curled once at his sides. He stopped the movement almost immediately. "I thought I had buried those connections." "You thought or you hoped." His silence landed harder than a confession. Nate cleared his throat softly. "Sir, we need to move her." Grace turned. "Move me where a secure location," Nate said. "No." Dominic's eyes snapped to her. "Grace, no. You do not get to let your past walk into my life and then pack me away like evidence." Dominic stepped closer, then stopped himself when he saw her stiffen. "If Rourke is watching you, your apartment is not safe. My apartment was not safe before. It was just cheap." "This is not a joke. I am not laughing." He closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, the anger was gone. What remained frightened her more because it looked like fear. "I cannot protect you from a distance." Grace's voice dropped. "Maybe I do not want to be protected by a man who will not tell me what he is protecting me from." Dominic flinched, barely, but she saw it. Nate looked away. Dominic took a slow breath. "Come with me to my penthouse. It is secure. Nate can sweep the cafe, pull camera footage, and set a watch here. I will tell you everything I can, everything you can, everything I know how to say." Grace stared at him. That was not enough. But the photo on her phone made stubbornness feel childish. She grabbed her coat from the office chair. 1 hour, she said. Then I go home. Dominic did not argue. Outside, Nate opened the rear door of a black sedan. Grace slid in first. Dominic followed, leaving a careful distance between them. The car pulled away from the curb, gliding through wet streets where neon signs bled red and gold across the pavement. New Orleans looked different through tinted glass, less like home, more like a city holding its secrets behind its teeth. Dominic's penthouse sat high above downtown, in a building with private elevators, silent security, and windows that made the city look like something owned. Grace had been there before, but tonight it felt unfamiliar. Too much glass, too much height, too many ways to see without being seen. Nate remained outside the door. Dominic crossed to a cabinet and poured whiskey into a glass. Grace watched him lift it. Then he set it down untouched. Good, she thought. She was not sure why it mattered. He stood with his back to her, facing the windows. Before Kane Development, there was Kane Freight, he said. Grace stayed near the sofa arms, folded tightly. My father worked the docks until an accident ended his body before it ended his life. My mother cleaned office buildings at night. We were poor in a way that makes every sound in the house mean money. A cough meant medicine. Rain meant roof damage. A late paycheck meant lights out. His voice was even, but Grace heard the old hunger beneath it. When I was 17, I started running errands at the docks. Messages first, then envelopes, then cargo manifests that did not match the cargo. I told myself I was helping my mother. I told myself honest work had failed my father, so I would find another kind. Grace's throat tightened despite herself. Dominic turned from the window. Miles Rourke noticed me because I was fast and angry and smart enough to keep my mouth shut. He gave me work, then money, then access. By 25, I was moving freight that did not exist on paper. By 28, I was negotiating with men who wore church shoes to meetings where they decided who disappeared. Grace felt the room tilt slightly. You were mafia. Dominic did not look away. Yes. The word was quiet. That made it worse. Not a rumor, not an article, not a headline softened by lawyers. Yes. Grace sat down slowly. Dominic remained standing. I never called it that when I was inside it. Men like us prefer cleaner language. Freight protection, private security, political leverage, debt enforcement. We wrap ugly things in useful words. Did you hurt people? His face changed. Yes. Grace's fingers tightened on the edge of the cushion. Directly, sometimes by order, sometimes by silence, sometimes by signing papers that gave other men room to do what I did not want to see. She closed her eyes. The man in front of her split in two. Dominic carrying chairs after closing. Dominic remembering Mrs. Tate's booth. Dominic touching her face like prayer. Dominic sitting in rooms where people disappeared by decision. Both were real. That was the horror. You let me fall in love with you without knowing this. His voice broke at the edge. I know. Grace stood because sitting made her feel trapped. You should have told me. Yes. Before the job, before the kiss, before I became something men like Miles Rourke could use. Yes. His agreement made her angrier. Do not stand there and make it easy by admitting everything. I am not trying to make it easy. Then what are you trying to do? Dominic looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked helpless. Not lose you before telling the truth. The words struck the softest part of her and enraged the rest. Grace turned away. The city shimmered below them. Somewhere down there was Crescent Harbor's old block changed forever. Somewhere down there people still came to Second Light because she had promised to keep the feeling alive. Somewhere down there the world was ordinary enough to envy. What does Rourke want? Access to the development. For what? Contracts. Shell companies. Movement of money. Maybe shipping tied to the riverfront. Maybe he simply wants proof he can still make me open a door. And if you refuse, he looks for leverage. Grace laughed without humor. That would be me. Dominic's face darkened. Yes, the honesty cut. He stepped closer slowly. I can fix this. Grace looked at him. The air changed. That old danger moved beneath his voice. Not aimed at her. Never at her. But alive all the same. How Dominic did not answer. Grace's stomach went cold. How Dominic. His eyes held hers. By making sure Rourke understands you are not to be touched. No. Grace. No. She moved toward him, anger burning through fear. I know that voice. That is not a man solving a problem. That is a man going back into the dark and calling it protection. His jaw tightened. You do not understand what men like Rourke respect. I understand enough. They respect fear, blood, retaliation. You give him that and you are his again. Dominic looked away. Grace stepped back. I need to go home. No. Her eyes flashed. Excuse me? He caught himself. The command had come too easily. He knew it. Shame crossed his face. Please, he said more quietly. Let Nate take you somewhere safe. My apartment. It is not safe. It is mine. Grace, I need space from you. Her voice shook now, but she forced it steady. No calls, no visits, no gifts, no cars waiting outside unless I ask. Security stays. She wanted to refuse. Pride rose fast and hot. Then she saw again the photo on her phone. Fine. Nate or someone he trusts can stay nearby. But invisible. Dominic nodded. Anything else? Yes. She walked to the door, then turned back. If you lie to me again, I am gone. His face emptied. Not of feeling, of hope. I know. Nate drove her home. Neither of them spoke for most of the ride. When they reached her building, rain had softened to mist. The street lamp outside flickered. Her apartment window glowed faintly above the stairwell because she had left one light on. Nate parked at the curb. I will be close, he said. Grace opened the door. Nate. He looked at her. How bad is Miles Rourke Nate's expression gave nothing away. But his answer did. Bad enough that Mr. Kane is afraid. Grace carried that upstairs like a stone in her chest. For 3 days, Dominic kept his word. He did not call. He did not text. He did not appear at the cafe. That somehow made the space feel both safer and emptier. Nate stayed nearby, though Grace almost never saw him. Once she caught sight of his reflection in the glass across the street. Once she noticed a man in a gray hoodie leave when a customer lingered too long near closing. Once a black car rolled past and did not return. Grace worked. That was what she knew how to do. She opened Second Light at 6. She checked the pastry delivery. She handled a complaint from a woman who insisted her cappuccino was too wet, though Grace still did not know how coffee could have a weather condition. She trained a new cashier. She ordered beans. She fixed the loose leg on Walter's preferred stool with a folded napkin because the proper repair had not held. Mrs. Tate watched her from the window booth. You look like a woman carrying a piano upstairs. Grace poured her coffee. That specific I have lived long enough to identify burdens by instrument. Grace smiled faintly. Mrs. Tate touched her hand. Whatever it is, do not let love make you stupid. Grace looked toward the street. I am trying. Trying is where most wisdom starts. On the 4th morning, before sunrise, someone pounded on Grace's apartment door. She woke hard, heart already racing. The pounding came again. Grace. Open the door. Nate. She grabbed her robe and looked through the peephole. Nate stood in the hallway, face grim, one hand inside his jacket. She opened the door. What happened? We need to move. Why? His eyes flicked over her shoulder, checking the apartment. Dominic was shot. The words did not enter her all at once. They struck, then echoed. Shot. Dominic. Is he alive? Yes. He is in surgery. Shoulder wound. Blood loss. We do not know who ordered it. Grace gripped the door frame. The hallway tilted. Nate caught her elbow before she noticed she had swayed. Grace. I am fine. You are not. Get dressed. 5 minutes. Pack medication, phone charger, anything you cannot replace quickly. She stared at him. Was it Rourke? We do not know. That means it could be. It could be several people. The sentence was worse than yes. Grace dressed with shaking hands. Jeans, sweater, boots, her mother's necklace. She packed a small bag and took the photo of her parents from the refrigerator before she could think about why. Nate led her down the back stairs. A car waited in the alley, engine running. As they drove through the waking city, Nate gave her what details he had. Dominic had left a private meeting near the warehouse district shortly after midnight. No public schedule. Only a few people knew where he would be. A motorcycle had come out of a side street. 3 shots, 1 hit. Dominic's driver got him to the hospital before the ambulance arrived. Grace watched gray dawn spread over the rooftops. Was he alone? No. Did anyone else get hurt? No. Then they were aiming for him. Nate said nothing. Grace turned toward the window. Her reflection looked pale and unfamiliar. He told me not to love the man he used to be, she whispered. Nate glanced at her through the mirror. What? Nothing. They did not take her to the hospital first. Nate brought her to a safe house outside the city, an ordinary-looking place on a quiet street lined with live oaks. Inside it was not ordinary. Reinforced doors, cameras, shaded windows. 2 armed men Grace did not know. She stood in the living room, bag still in hand. I want to see him. Nate shook his head. No. Nate. He is in surgery. Then I will wait. It is not secure yet. I do not care. You should. Grace stepped toward him. The man I love may wake up thinking I left. Nate's face softened by a fraction. He would not think that. You do not know what fear tells wounded men. For a long moment, Nate said nothing. Then he pulled out his phone. I will make arrangements. You do exactly what I say. No arguments. Grace nodded. 3 hours later, they entered the hospital through a service corridor that smelled like bleach and warm plastic. Nate moved fast. Grace followed between 2 guards past laundry carts and supply doors into a freight elevator that rose without stopping. The private floor was quiet. Too quiet. Men in dark jackets stood near every entrance. Eleanor Mercer sat in the waiting room, her silver hair pulled back, her suit wrinkled for the first time Grace had ever seen. When she saw Grace, relief moved across her face so quickly it nearly broke her composure. Thank God. Grace reached her. How is he out of surgery? The bullet went through the shoulder, missed the artery. Significant tissue damage. He will live. Grace closed her eyes. The relief was so sharp it hurt. Eleanor took both her hands. He has asked for you every time he surfaces. Mostly he asks if you are safe. Grace laughed once, but it came out like a sob. Of course he does. A nurse led her into the room. Dominic lay in the bed, colorless under the white sheets, his left shoulder wrapped heavily in bandages. An IV ran into his hand. Monitors traced his life in green lines and soft beeps. He looked wrong without power around him. Or maybe he looked truer. His eyes opened when she stepped closer. For a second, he seemed unsure whether she was real. Grace. Her name was Rough Barely Sound. She moved to the bed and took his uninjured hand. I leave you alone for 3 days, and you get shot. A weak smile touched his mouth. I have always been dramatic. This is not funny. No. The smile faded. His fingers tightened weakly around hers. You are safe. Yes. Nate. With me. Good. Grace sat beside him, tears burning her eyes. Who did this? I do not know. Rourke. Maybe. Maybe not. How many people want you dead, Dominic? His eyes closed for a moment. Enough. The answer settled between them. Grace looked at the machines, the bandages, the man who had entered her life like a storm and now lay wounded because storms eventually met something harder. I should be furious with you. You are. Yes. You should be. Yes. His thumb moved against her hand. If this is too much, I will understand. Grace looked at him. His face was pale. His voice was thin. But the offer was real. He would let her leave. It would cost him. But he would. That should have made leaving easier. It did not. I do not owe you my life because you gave me a job, she said. Pain crossed his eyes. I know. I do not owe you forgiveness because you told me the truth after danger forced you to. I know. I do not owe you love just because you need it. His voice broke. I know. Grace leaned closer. But I get to choose where I stand. Dominic stared at her. She held his hand with both of hers. So you are going to tell me everything. Not the romantic version. Not the version where your guilt wears a clean suit. Everything. He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. Over the next hours, between pain medication and exhaustion, Dominic spoke. He told her about the docks, about Rourke, about Kane Freight, about the first time he realized money could move faster in the dark, about men he had trusted because they smiled like uncles and ordered violence like dinner, about favors traded with politicians, about buildings acquired after tenants were squeezed by pressure that never touched his name on paper. He did not make himself noble. That mattered. He did not say he had no choice. That mattered more. I wanted power, he said quietly. Not only safety. Power. I wanted never to beg again. Never to wait outside a closed office hoping someone inside cared whether my mother had electricity. I told myself every cruel thing was temporary, a bridge to something legitimate. Grace listened with her stomach tight. And then the bridge became a road. Then the road became an empire. And by the time I wanted clean ground, I had forgotten what it felt like. He looked at her. Until Crescent Harbor. Grace wiped her cheek quickly. Do not make me your absolution. I am not. Good. You were a mirror, he said. That was worse. Before she could answer, the door opened. Nate stepped in, tense. Sir. Dominic's eyes sharpened despite the medication. What Miles Rourke is here? Grace felt the room change. Dominic pushed himself up and immediately hissed through his teeth. Do not be stupid, Grace said, pressing a hand lightly against his uninjured side. His mouth twitched. Hard to resist. Nate moved closer. I can have him removed. Dominic shook his head. If Rourke came himself, he wants to be seen not hiding. Let him in. Grace stood. Dominic looked at her. You should go. No. Grace. No more locked rooms. His face tightened, but he did not argue. Nate opened the door. Miles Rourke entered alone. He was older than Grace expected, maybe early 60s, with silver hair combed back and a gray suit that looked modest until one noticed the cut. He carried no weapon Grace could see. He did not need to. Danger moved with him like a second shadow. His eyes went to Dominic first. Dom. Dominic's voice turned cold. Miles. Rourke smiled. Someone shoots you and suddenly everyone whispers my name. I find that disrespectful. If you want respect, stop hiring men who threaten women in cafes. Rourke's gaze moved to Grace. There it was. the full attention of something patient and predatory. So this is the smile. Grace's mouth went dry. She lifted her chin. And you are the debt. For a second silence, then Rourke laughed softly. Pretty and sharp. That combination makes men careless. Dominic's hand tightened around the sheet. Speak to me. I am. Rourke walked farther into the room. You look weak. I dislike seeing old friends weak. We were never friends. No. You were a hungry boy with good instincts. I was generous. You were useful. Rourke's smile thinned. And now you are legitimate. A developer. A philanthropist. A man of ribbon cuttings and newspaper profiles. His eyes flicked to Grace. A man in love. Grace felt Dominic's fear before she saw it. Rourke noticed too. I did not shoot you, he said. Dominic watched him. If I had, you would not be in a hospital. You would be in the river, and she would be receiving flowers. Nate moved half a step forward. Rourke did not look at him. Dominic believed him. Grace could tell. That was worse than disbelief. Then why are you here? Dominic asked. To remind you that other men are less disciplined than I am. You have enemies, Dom. Some mine, some yours. Some born from the little empire you are trying so hard to bleach. He reached into his jacket pocket. Nate's hand went to his weapon. Rourke paused, amused, then withdrew a small envelope and placed it on the bedside table. Names, he said. 3 men who might have ordered the shooting. You will recognize, too. Dominic did not touch it. What do you want? There he is, Rourke said warmly. The boy from the docks. Always knew where the price was hidden. Grace could feel her pulse in her throat. Rourke moved toward the window. The riverfront project has several contracts not yet assigned. Waste management, security, import supply for restaurant tenants. Give them to companies I recommend. No. Rourke turned. Then old records find daylight. Not rumors. Records. Enough to ruin your company. Reopen federal interest, make every investor flee. Perhaps even enough to make your lovely Grace here wonder if she built her cafe on bones. Grace's stomach tightened. Dominic's face became stone. You touch her cafe and I will end you. Rourke smiled. There. That is the man I came to visit. Grace looked at Dominic and saw it. The old self rising. The part of him that knew how to answer threat with blood darkness, with something darker. Rourke walked to the door. I will give you 48 hours. After that, I begin assuming you have chosen sentiment over memory. He paused beside Grace. You should know sweetheart monsters do not become men because a woman smiles at them. They become better-dressed monsters. Grace met his eyes. Maybe. But some men only stay monsters because everyone keeps calling them one. Rourke's smile faded. Then he left. The door closed. Dominic looked at the envelope on the table. Grace looked at Dominic. The room seemed too quiet. He wants me to choose, Dominic said. No, Grace answered. He wants you to become yourself again. Dominic's jaw tightened. If I refuse, he exposes everything. Investors leave. Projects collapse. People lose jobs. Second Light becomes part of a scandal. And if you agree he owns the door, you do not understand the scale of this. I understand enough. Dominic turned on her, pain and fear sharpening his voice. Rourke does not sue. He does not protest. He burns lives down until the ashes sign contracts. Grace stepped closer to the bed. And what do? He went still. She lowered her voice. What does Dominic Kane do when he is scared enough? His eyes held hers. In them she saw the answer he hated. She sat on the edge of the bed. No, you do not know what I was going to say. Yes, I do. Grace. No. Her voice shook, but it did not break. "I will not be the reason you go back. You are the reason I have to stop him." "No, I am the excuse you are using because fear feels cleaner when it calls itself love." The words hit him hard. He looked away. Grace took his hand, carefully avoiding the IV. "You told me clean money does not erase dirty hands. Then stop trying to look clean and become honest." Dominic gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "Honest men go to prison. Maybe guilty ones do." His eyes came back to hers. She did not soften the truth. "Go to the authorities." The room seemed to freeze. Dominic stared at her. "You are asking me to destroy my life. I am asking you to stop letting Rourke own it. You have no idea what would happen." "Then tell me." He looked toward the door, then at the envelope, then at the city beyond the window. "Federal prosecutors have wanted Rourke for years. They wanted me too once. They never had enough. If I cooperate, I could give them roots, names, shell companies, political payments, old ledgers. I could bury him, then do it. I would bury myself with him." Grace's heart clenched. "How much charges?" "Fines, restitution, prison maybe. Investors would run. Camille would try to take control. My name would become poison." Grace's eyes burned. "Your name already has ghosts in it." He closed his eyes. She leaned closer. "I love the man who built Second Light. I love the man who remembered Mrs. Tate's booth. I love the man who apologized when he tried to control me, but I cannot love the man who walks back into blood and calls it protection." Dominic opened his eyes. For a moment he looked stripped of every defense. "What if I lose everything?" Grace's voice softened. "Then we find out what is left when power is gone." The door opened again, but this time it was Eleanor. She stepped inside holding a leather folder, her face pale but determined. "I know someone," she said. Dominic looked at her. Eleanor closed the door behind her. "Sarah Whitcomb, federal prosecutor, Southern District. She has been building toward Rourke for 6 years." Dominic said nothing. Eleanor moved to the foot of the bed. "She will not give you immunity. Do not ask. She will offer cooperation consideration, reduced exposure if your evidence is good enough. But you will pay." Grace looked at Dominic. He looked older than he had an hour before. "Did you call her?" he asked Eleanor. "No, not yet." Why not? Eleanor's eyes shifted to Grace, then back. "Because this choice cannot be managed for you." For a long moment Dominic said nothing. The rain had stopped outside. Sunlight pressed weakly through the hospital window, turning the city pale. Dominic looked at Grace. She did not plead. She did not promise that everything would be fine. They both knew it would not. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "Call her." Eleanor exhaled. Grace felt tears slide down her face. Dominic's hand tightened around hers. He looked at the envelope Rourke had left, then back at Grace. "I wanted to become clean without becoming exposed." Grace wiped her cheek. "I know. I wanted redemption without ruin." "I know." His eyes held hers. "Stay while I burn it down." Grace leaned forward and pressed her forehead gently to his. "Tell the truth," she whispered. "Then ask me again." Dominic closed his eyes. Outside the hospital room, men moved through the hallway. Phones rang. Footsteps quickened. Somewhere in the building, a prosecutor's number was being dialed. Somewhere in New Orleans, Miles Rourke still believed he had given Dominic Kane 2 choices. Grace held Dominic's hand as the first call connected. Dominic listened to the voice on the other end. Then he spoke clearly. "My name is Dominic Kane. I have information on Miles Rourke, and I am prepared to give a full statement." Grace sat beside him when he said it, her hand wrapped around his, her thumb resting over the pulse in his wrist. His voice was steady. His face was not. The bandage at his shoulder rose and fell with each careful breath, and the room seemed to understand that something irreversible had happened. On the other end of the call, the federal prosecutor went silent for half a second. Then Sarah Whitcomb began asking questions. Dominic answered. Not all at once, not easily, but clearly. Names, dates, companies, routes through Gulf ports, judges who had looked away, councilmen who had taken campaign money through clean foundations and dirty hands, warehouses registered under dead men's names, security firms that were not security firms. Grace listened until the words stopped sounding like evidence and began sounding like the bones beneath a city. Eleanor stood near the window, arms folded tightly across her chest. Nate waited by the door, his face carved from stone. Outside the hospital room, men moved quickly and spoke into phones with low voices. The world Dominic Kane had spent years building in shadow had finally found a door into the light, and light was not gentle. When the call ended, Dominic closed his eyes. Grace did not speak. She did not tell him he had done the right thing. She did not say everything would be fine. Nothing about the room felt fine. His company was already trembling. His enemies were still breathing. His name was about to become a headline sharp enough to cut everyone close to him. Dominic opened his eyes and looked at her. "You should go home." Grace almost laughed. "You say that a lot for a man who keeps making it impossible." "I mean it this time." "So do I." She leaned forward and placed the phone back on the bedside table. "I am not going home because the truth finally walked in." His eyes moved across her face, searching for fear, disgust, regret. She knew he found all three. She let him see them. Love that required blindness was only another kind of lie. "I am scared," she said. His jaw tightened. "I know. I am angry. I know. I do not know who we are after this." His eyes glistened, though no tear fell. "Neither do I." Grace nodded. "Then at least we are finally telling the truth." By nightfall, the first arrests began. Grace watched it unfold from the hospital television with the volume low. Federal agents in dark jackets moved through warehouses along the river. A city council aide covered his face with a file folder as cameras caught him outside his home. 2 men connected to Rourke's shipping network were taken from a private club near the Garden District before dessert even reached the table. By morning, Dominic Kane's name was everywhere. Developer linked to federal organized crime probe. Kane cooperates with prosecutors in Gulf corruption case. Riverfront billionaire admits past criminal ties. Grace stood in the hospital bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink while her phone buzzed over and over on the counter. Calls from unknown numbers, messages from reporters, a voicemail from June that began with, "Honey, do not answer anyone who sounds polite and hungry." When Grace returned to the room, Dominic was watching the news without blinking. On screen, Camille Sterling stood outside Kane Tower in a cream suit, her face solemn, her voice smooth. Kane Development Group remains committed to transparency, stability, and the community investments our partners expect. Grace stopped in the doorway. Dominic's expression did not change, but Eleanor's did. "She is moving," Eleanor said. Dominic looked at her. "How fast?" "Fast enough that she had that statement ready before the second arrest." Grace crossed the room. "What does that mean?" Eleanor turned toward her. "It means Camille is going to convince the board that Dominic's cooperation protects his conscience but endangers the company. She will offer herself as the clean hand to guide the business through scandal." Dominic gave a tired smile. Camille has never seen a collapsing bridge she did not want to own. Grace looked at him, and second light. No one answered quickly enough. That was the answer. Dominic reached for her hand. She let him take it. "I will protect the cafe." Grace pulled her hand back gently. "No." Pain crossed his face. She sat beside him. "You do not get to protect everything for me anymore. You are in a hospital bed about to fight the federal government, Miles Rourke, your board, and every ghost you buried under a contract. I can protect the cafe." Dominic studied her. There was pride in his eyes, but also grief, as if he knew this was part of losing the version of her who had once needed him to open every door. Eleanor placed a folder on the small table. "Then you will need this." Inside were contracts, revenue reports, community impact statements, local hiring numbers, letters from former Crescent Harbor customers, and documentation showing that Second Light was one of the few public-facing parts of the development still receiving positive community response. Grace ran her fingers over the pages. "You prepared this?" Eleanor's mouth tightened. "I prepare for disasters. Men usually qualify." Grace almost smiled. The board meeting took place 3 days later. Dominic was still in the hospital. Grace walked into Kane Tower wearing a navy dress, low heels, and her mother's silver necklace. Her hands were cold, but they did not shake. Eleanor walked beside her. Noah Reed waited outside the boardroom with a stack of design documents and a face that looked like he had not slept. Camille sat at the head of the table when Grace entered. Not Dominic's seat exactly, but close enough to make the point. Several board members looked surprised to see Grace. One looked annoyed. One looked at her like she was a waitress who had wandered into the wrong private dining room. Grace had seen that look before. It did not work on her anymore. Camille smiled. "Grace, I was not aware this meeting involved cafe operations." Grace placed her folder on the table. "It involves whether Second Light remains part of the development." A man in a gray suit cleared his throat. "The cafe's public association with Mr. Kane creates a reputational concern." Grace looked at him. "Second Light employs 19 people, 12 from the original neighborhood. It serves more than 600 customers a week. 40% of morning sales come from local residents. The community program has brought in students, seniors, book clubs, local artists, and neighborhood meetings that would otherwise have nowhere to gather." Camille leaned back. "Admirable. But sentiment does not shield investors." Grace opened the folder. "No, performance does." She passed out the reports. "The cafe is profitable. Not wildly, not greedily, sustainably. It is the only tenant in the development with positive local press this week. If you sell or rebrand it now, the story becomes simple. Kane Development used community language until the community became inconvenient." Silence settled. Camille's eyes narrowed. Grace continued. "You can distance the company from Dominic Kane without erasing the one thing he built that people still trust. Transfer partial control of Second Light to a community trust. Keep Kane Development as landlord with capped rent for 5 years. Let local representatives sit on the advisory board. Let the cafe belong to the people who fill it." One board member leaned forward. "Did Mr. Kane authorize that Eleanor spoke before Grace could? He signed preliminary approval this morning." Camille's face did not move, but Grace saw the anger enter her eyes. "You are asking this company to surrender control of a premium ground floor asset during a crisis." Grace looked at her. "No, I am asking you to stop calling it community investment if the community never gets a key." Noah slid his documents forward. "The architectural team supports the trust structure. It preserves the original development mission and protects tenant stability." Eleanor added, "It also makes financial sense." Camille looked around the table and saw the shift before anyone voted. Grace saw it too. For the first time, she protected something Dominic loved without standing behind him. The motion passed. Not unanimously. Enough. When Grace left the boardroom, she stepped into the hallway, pressed one hand to the wall, and breathed. Eleanor stood beside her. "You did well." Grace closed her eyes. "That is twice now. Do not get used to it." But Eleanor's voice was softer than usual. The trial came months later. By then, Miles Rourke had been arrested along with men who had believed for years that money, fear, and silence were better protection than law. Some took deals. Some threatened to talk and then discovered everyone was already talking. Rourke himself said nothing to cameras. He only smiled once as agents guided him into a courthouse, and that smile made Grace understand why Dominic had feared him. Dominic had recovered enough to stand, though his shoulders still ached in cold weather. He wore a dark suit to court, but he looked different in it now. Less armored, more exposed. The old Dominic Kane had worn power like a second body. This man wore consequence. Grace sat behind him. June sat beside her, one hand closed around Grace's. Walter sat on Grace's other side, muttering about courtroom coffee. Mrs. Tate had insisted on coming and wore her biggest pearls. When Dominic rose to speak, the room quieted. He did not turn to Grace first. He looked at the people seated behind her. Former tenants, workers, community members. Some had come to witness justice. Some had come to see him fall. Some had come because harm deserves a face. Dominic placed both hands on the table. I spent years believing survival explained the choices I made, he said. It did not. Poverty hurt me. It did not give me permission to hurt others. Fear shaped me. It did not excuse what I became. I built good things later and told myself they balanced the harm that came before. They did not. Grace felt June's hand tighten around hers. Dominic's voice remained steady. I cannot undo the past. I can tell the truth about it. I can accept the cost. I can return what can be returned and spend whatever life I have left making repair instead of hiding behind success. He looked down for a second. Then he looked at the judge. I am guilty of more than what appears in the charges. I understand that now. The sentence fell softly, but it shook the room. Dominic received 18 months in federal prison, heavy financial penalties, restitution obligations, and continued cooperation. The press outside shouted his name when they left. Dominic did not answer. Grace walked with him until the courthouse steps where security held a narrow path through cameras and microphones. They stopped beside the waiting car. He turned to her. I do not know what I will be when I come back. Grace looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, at the man stripped of empire and still standing. Then come back honest. He nodded. There were too many people watching for the kiss she wanted to give him. So she took his hand and held it once hard. That had to be enough. The 18 months did not pass quickly. People said time moves on. Grace learned that it also drags circles, stalls, and waits outside locked doors. She opened second light every morning before sunrise. The cafe became louder, warmer, more necessary. The community trust took shape. A local teacher joined the advisory board. Walter somehow became responsible for minor repairs, though nothing he fixed stayed fixed for long. Mrs. Tate hosted crossword mornings. June visited every few months and criticized the cinnamon rolls until she admitted they were nearly right. Grace learned to negotiate without apologizing. She learned to fire an employee kindly and hire a better one carefully. She spoke at City Council about responsible development with her notes trembling in her hand and her voice steady by the second paragraph. She created a small fund for displaced businesses using donations, cafe profits, and money Dominic had set aside before sentencing. The first recipient was Arthur Reed, who opened a smaller bookshop 2 blocks away with a reading corner and a chair by the window. Reporters eventually moved on. Customers stopped whispering. The cafe stayed. Dominic wrote letters. They came in plain envelopes, his handwriting neat and controlled at first, then looser as the months passed. He wrote about the sound of doors locking at night, about the strange mercy of being nobody important, about men who reminded him of who he might have become if one different person had offered a hand instead of a weapon, about shame that arrived without warning, about missing the smell of coffee before dawn, about grace, not in grand declarations, in details. I thought of you today when the rain hit the windows during breakfast. You would hate the coffee here. I am learning that silence is not the same as peace. I do not want to come back and be forgiven. I want to come back and be useful. Grace kept the letters in a wooden box beneath her bed. She wrote back after closing when the cafe was quiet and the city outside hummed softly. She told him about Walter breaking the counter stool he had sworn he fixed, about Mrs. Tate falling asleep in her booth and refusing to admit it, about June bringing a new cinnamon roll recipe from Mississippi and declaring war on Grace's pastry supplier, about Eleanor accepting a permanent role on the community trust and terrifying everyone into efficiency. Sometimes Grace wrote that she missed him so badly it made her angry. Sometimes she wrote only 3 lines. Today was hard. I did not quit. I hope you did not either. Winter turned to spring. Spring folded into summer. On a clear autumn morning, Grace drove an old blue pickup June had loaned her to the federal facility where Dominic was being released. She arrived early and parked beneath a pale sky. No limousine, no black convoy, no press. Just Grace, both hands on the steering wheel, breathing through the ache in her chest. When Dominic stepped outside, he carried 1 bag. He wore jeans, a plain gray coat, and no expression he did not need. His hair was shorter. He looked thinner, quieter. The old force was still there, but it no longer pushed ahead of him. He saw Grace, stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Grace smiled. Not by accident, not because she was nervous, because he was there, because he had come back honest. Dominic's face changed. The breath left him slowly, as if her smile had crossed the distance and struck some place prison had not been able to reach. He walked to her. "You know," he said, voice rough, "the first time you did that, it ruined my life." Grace looked up at him. "Looks like it needed ruining." A soft laugh broke from him, fragile and real. "I do not have what I had before. Good. I am not who I was. Also good. I cannot promise easy." Grace took his hand. "I never trusted easy." They drove back to New Orleans with the windows cracked and the city waiting ahead in gold light. Dominic looked out at streets he knew too well and seemed to see them differently, as if every corner now asked a question. When they reached Second Light, the lunch rush was just beginning. Grace parked across the street. Dominic stared at the cafe. The gold letters on the green sign. The windows full of people. The community board crowded with flyers. Walter at the counter. Mrs. Tate in her booth. June visible through the glass, arguing with someone in the kitchen, though she did not work there. Dominic did not move. Grace touched his arm. "You can wait." He shook his head. "No. I have waited long enough." They crossed the street together. The bell above the door rang. Conversation quieted, not completely, but enough. Walter turned first. He stared at Dominic for a long second, then lifted his mug. "You still owe this neighborhood better coffee prices." Dominic looked at Grace. Grace shrugged. "He is not wrong." Mrs. Tate patted the seat across from her. "Sit down, Mr. Kane. You look like you could use breakfast." Dominic's throat moved. June came out carrying a plate with a cinnamon roll the size of a small miracle. "Well," she said, setting it in front of him, "if it is not trouble in a clean shirt." Dominic looked up at her. "Good to see you, June. We will see." But she handed him a fork. That was forgiveness in June's language. Not full, not simple, but beginning. After closing, Dominic stayed to help Grace stack chairs. This time, he did not look expensive doing cheap labor. He looked like a man learning where to put his hands. Outside, New Orleans glowed under streetlights. Somewhere down the block, a trumpet played slow and sweet. The Mississippi moved in the dark, carrying old sins past new windows. Grace wiped the counter while Dominic cleaned the last table. "You do not have to do that," she said. He looked at the rag in his hand. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." She understood he meant more than the table. When the last light was turned off, they stood together by the front window. The cafe behind them smelled of coffee, cinnamon wood, and rain. In the glass, Grace saw their reflections side by side. Not rescued girl and dangerous man, not boss and waitress, not monster and salvation. Just two people standing inside the life that truth had left behind. Dominic looked at her reflection. Do you ever regret smiling at me? Grace thought of Crescent Harbor, the fear, the first offer, the kiss, the threats, the hospital, the trial, the letters, the 18 months. The people who still had a place to go because something broken had not been thrown away. She turned to him. No. Dominic closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, Grace smiled again. The same smile. Gentle, honest, human. But this time Dominic Kane did not fall because of it. He stood, and beside him Grace stood too. Grace.